Well, good morning, and welcome to the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation's event in association with TEConomy partners on lessons learned from global life sciences ecosystems in the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Stephen Ezel, the Vice President of Global Innovation Policy at ITIF. We're delighted to have you with us today, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. As we'll see, with more than 750 unique compounds, including novel vaccines and therapeutics, now under development globally to combat COVID-19, and with close to 100 of those compounds in the final stages of development, the effort to combat the COVID-19 pandemic has represented a truly global response. And while clearly the pandemic has caused tremendous dislocations, loss of life, and economic damage globally, there is hope that lessons learned, especially from the global life science community's rapid response to the virus, that can leave us with lasting lessons about how we can more effectively combat future pandemics and how we can more effectively innovate new vaccines, treatments, and therapies in the future, especially for challenges such as neglected tropical diseases or treatments for various forms of cancer we've not been able to address in the past. There are also lessons to be learned in terms of developing more dynamic international partnerships and collaborations in life sciences innovation, how to educate biotech industry workforces, and how to tackle the challenges of scaling production of vaccines and therapeutics and managing distribution and access challenges. Now, the 750 aforementioned unique compounds being developed globally in response to COVID-19, nearly half of those compounds are being developed in the United States. And that's evidence of a very healthy US life sciences innovation ecosystem that we've constructed over the past 4 decades that has helped America become a global life sciences innovation leader. Policies like robust investment in life sciences R&D, strong incentives to invest in life sciences innovation, R&D tax credits, strong intellectual property rights, et cetera. So while the US experience has many lessons to offer other nations, as Simon's report will show, this crisis has also revealed how we in America have much to learn ourselves. So as I said, our keynote speaker today is Mr. Simon Tripp. He is Principal and Senior Director at TEConomy Partners, and he'll show lessons learned for other nations and from all nations from their new report, Response and Resilience, Lessons Learned from the Global Life Sciences Response to the Pandemic. Simon has helped make TEConomy Partners a global leader in research, analysis, and strategy for innovation-driven economic development. Before joining TEConomy, Simon was a senior director at the Battelle Technology Partnership Practice, and before that, he was an owner and principal in 2 specialized research firms, Impact Economics and Tripp, Umbach & Associates. After Simon's keynote, we will hear from Mr. Patrick Holmes, who was a senior director and innovation policy lead at Pfizer, where he leads a team with responsibility for developing global health policy initiatives and evidence across a series of policy issues to drive R&D driven life sciences innovation. Patrick represents Pfizer on several health and biopharma working groups, including the Business at OECD Health Committee, the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and the Association's Value Access Committee. And Patrick has worked across multiple facets of the biopharmaceutical business during his nearly 30-year career at Pfizer. And before taking his current position, he served as Vice President Strategy and Portfolio Support. Patrick has a BA in Biology from Middlebury College and a Master's from MIT in Management. Finally, we'll hear from Mr. David Beyer. David is the Managing Director of Bay City Capital, a leading life sciences venture capital investor. An expert on the nation's life sciences innovation system, David is a globally recognized leader in healthcare policy, pricing, intellectual property, government affairs, regulatory affairs, and healthcare economics. David spent 2 decades as part of the senior management teams for Amgen and Genentech, and previously served in the White House as the chief domestic policy advisor to Vice President Al Gore during the Clinton administration. David is also currently an adjunct lecturer at the Haas School of Business at Berkeley as a senior fellow at the USC Schaefer Center for Health Policy and Economics. Before I turn it over to Simon for his presentation, let me note that the audience can submit questions to the panelists via the Slido application, which is found at the bottom of the event homepage on the ITF homepage. So we welcome your questions. And with that, let me turn the conversation over to Simon for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. It's great to have the opportunity to discuss the findings of our research with everybody today. Thanks to all of you for joining us. So in terms of the project goal, well, clearly COVID-19 has been and continues to be an extremely challenging disease. It's created a fast-moving pandemic and activated life science communities worldwide in the quest to develop rapid and accurate diagnostics, therapeutics, and of course vaccines. The global nature of the challenge has provided us with an opportunity to examine the responsiveness of existing life science ecosystems collectively and individually across the globe, and to reflect on what has worked well and what has not worked well in the fight against the pandemic. Our project examined pandemic response within ecosystems worldwide, and we undertook specific case studies of 13 nations known for having significant R&D and production ecosystems in human life sciences. The analysis provides a series of lessons learned that form the basis of a report designed to help national leaders and their life sciences ecosystems best position themselves for when the next big pandemic or public health challenge occurs. And I think we all know that that's really just a matter of time. We began the evaluation process by determining a typical life science ecosystem and developing a structure for that ecosystem. This then served as the organizing backbone for our subsequent analysis. We started by considering the core value chain that innovates, tests, produces, and distributes life sciences products. And then we considered the structural elements of the markets in which delivery of healthcare products occurs. We also accounted in structure for the major cross-cutting elements that support and enable life science ecosystem operations: talent, financial capital, and of course public policies and regulations. And that last area of policies and regulations was certainly a target-rich environment, with the pandemic providing a real proving ground for the interface between governments and industry. With our framework in place, we then began the process of examining what has happened globally. And as we accumulated knowledge, we classified the lessons learned into their appropriate ecosystem element. We then organized the report to match that ecosystem structure. And I'm going to step us through each of the lessons learned at a relatively high level. And I would, of course, encourage you to download the report from our website for further insights and analysis. So in terms of that first element, of R&D, well, firstly, a key finding is how diverse the source of innovations has been during the pandemic. Industry, of course, comes into play in the space for many innovations, and for pretty much all of them when it comes to production and distribution. I would note that collaborations have proven to be particularly important, including collaborations between the universities and industry, non-profits and industry, and indeed between multiple companies, often companies that are competitors. The vaccines that proved most rapidly to come forward into major trials were largely the result of collaborations. And in the report, we have a graphic illustrating that fact. I don't believe that the third bullet here really has been well enough recognized. Those in R&D have performed their work in the midst of a pandemic that impacted their working environments and their personal lives. There's certainly a lesson here in the importance of prioritizing personal protective equipment and other critical resources to those engaged in research. They're clearly essential workers. Also, I think a key finding is that large-scale publicly funded scientific infrastructure paid off in terms of being deployed against the coronavirus. The massive synchrotrons, such as the Diamond Light Source in the UK, or at Brookhaven National Laboratory, the National Synchrotron Light Source 2, those provided the ability to image the virus at really high resolution and the biological processes involved. The national supercomputing resources also have been highly leveraged worldwide. Those resources are simply too expensive to be developed by individual companies, and it's important to recognize and celebrate the fact that these big iron attributes of the scientific infrastructure worldwide have been put to work really working on the pandemic. The final bullet's obviously critically important to relay as well. When politicians or special interests might question in the future the cost of government investment in research, grants, and instrumentation funding, we now have ample evidence to show the far greater cost of inaction. In terms of clinical trials, well, trials can be segmented three ways. We looked at those that could be temporarily suspended, those that had to be maintained because they affected patients' health during the trial, And then, of course, new trials that had to be stood up specific to COVID, and we pay particular attention to that last group. It's evident that quick facilitation and adoption of contactless and virtual trials supported activities were an important element in sustaining and starting new trials. Patient consults were able to be performed using telemedicine, and medications were delivered through contactless pathways. In biomedical products, the processes used by companies are designed to be responsive to the demands of regulatory structures and restrictions, and some of the existing rules could have significantly slowed down advancement of COVID fighting products, but we've seen regulatory agencies in the US, in Europe, and other global locations being surprisingly flexible and responsive in providing timely guidance, quick approval for trials, and emergency use authorizations. Speed of action has obviously been critical. And what we've seen is that processes in trials that have usually required many months to operationalize have proven to be accomplishable in weeks. Given the humanitarian and economic costs associated with the pandemic, it's fair to say that regulators took a perfect should not be the enemy of the good approach, and it's been the right approach to take. In terms of biopharmaceutical production, innovation has not only come from big pharma companies, it's also come from a diversity of large and quite small ventures. However, it's very apparent that big pharma has the production expertise and horsepower needed to advance critical products into production. Companies have been laudably willing to collaborate with each other to provide manufacturing capacity and expertise. In terms of the supply chain, it's certainly fair to say there have been some observable challenges, although I also think it's fair to say that some of the challenges experienced were not as bad as many have depicted them to be. Ports of entry certainly slowed down. Airline flights were significantly restricted, and therefore the transportation of cargo in passenger flight holds. And also some countries moved to interfere in export of products. But overall, the supply chain was relatively resilient for biopharmaceutical products, less so though for PPE. We think the need for speed supports an argument for government regulators to accelerate work in review and approvals of advanced production technologies as well for biopharmaceutical manufacturing, including in areas like continuous manufacturing, single-use systems, and modular manufacturing that might come into play in future events. On the fourth bullet, it would seem that this ought to perhaps become a new normal to build efficiency and cost savings into the system. In terms of the distribution network, in terms of supply chains and distribution, it's probably fair to say that the pandemic has raised the importance of risk mitigation and resiliency, and perhaps reduced the emphasis on pure cost efficiency in supply chains. Certainly having a contingency plan and an emergency inventory where feasible certainly makes sense. Also, it's important to communicate to governments the importance of not interrupting international supply chains. The key lesson is that nationalism really doesn't work in a global pandemic when it's in the interests of a connected world and a global economy to get the pandemic under control everywhere. The final bullet has a large role to play in terms of building resiliency into the system. Wider technology investment and adoption here can provide real-time support monitoring of supply chains, allow reach back into supply chains, and generally build a more resilient supply chain and distribution system. Indeed, it's making the current distribution of Pfizer's vaccine possible through continuous cold chain monitoring using digital systems. Life sciences, I think we would all recognize, are inherently driven by a highly educated and skilled talent base. And it takes considerable time to train that talent base and produce that workforce. So protecting the workforce you have is clearly critical, because you're not going to get more produced in real time in the midst of a pandemic. Having a pre-existing strategy in place for promoting and facilitating remote work also is obviously beneficial. I think there's also going to be space planning implications for future operations and physical investments. And we also expect industrial and distribution, automation and robotics investments to increase post-pandemic in the life sciences. The last bullet here is important to note too, that almost all major industries are in competition for advanced computational and digital analytics talent. Building a talent base that has both life sciences and digital analytics skills is highly important, and that may require some new models in our academic systems for cross-training. We've got lots of examples in the report on the first bullet of government stepping up to the plate with COVID-specific funding for research advancements. COVID also provides an ability to communicate to policymakers that the vaccines and other advancements we've seen certainly didn't spring out of thin air. Rather, they resulted from long-term capital investments in basic and applied life sciences research that built the platforms and discoveries that enabled these advancements. Government plays a critically important role in early stage research upon which subsequent innovation depends, and that point needs to be repeatedly emphasized to policymakers. On the second bullet, we see multiple examples of governments providing funding to help build manufacturing capacity and advance production. This co-investment's been important to help companies mitigate risk in developing production capacity in advance of having a proven product. Big Pharma certainly had the financial and intellectual capital resources to make partnerships work and a willingness to put those resources to work. I think it's important to note that in the face of a global economic downturn, pharma companies did not entrench and hoard cash. Rather, they stepped up and invested at risk. That deserves wide recognition. We also saw the stock prices for a number of biopharmaceutical companies take off when they had promising products. That obviously gives us a lesson to learn that if you own a significant amount of your own stock, that may give you a quick capital infusion for investment in addressing pandemics. And we also found that robust risk capital markets paid off as well. In terms of policies and regulation, I guess the first bullet speaks to the well-known medical ethics rule of above all, do no harm. It's important to communicate that attention needs to be paid to assuring that panicky pandemic responses and knee-jerk policy responses don't cause harm to the life science ecosystems that are trying to provide solutions. We certainly can see that pre-planned responses and emergency contingency plans generally work very well at a national level. Korea and Taiwan, for example, are great examples of a national plan executed extremely quickly and effectively. Unfortunately, the US, where we're based, is an example of the damage that could be caused by ignoring a pre-existing plan, and there's been a relatively heavy price paid. The liability issue is one that shouldn't be ignored, and what we're talking about here is issues not only in the product liability when you're trying to work fast to produce a product for humanitarian use, but also perhaps in liability for future shareholder litigation that might occur for companies that built manufacturing capacity at risk that then has risk of being a stranded asset. Finally on here, the disinformation issue is huge. Social media exacerbated the challenge. We've seen that misinformation and deliberate disinformation can spread rapidly and impact the effectiveness of even the most prestigious organizations such as the CDC through politicization. We should not either ignore the fact that a significant number of actors chose to do the wrong thing and endanger public health, and that needs to be factored into future plans. That type of behavior we need to understand and factor it into our future planning. In terms of customers and markets, I guess the first bullet speaks to the well-known, apparently a public health crisis of this magnitude can bulldoze barriers to new technology and move those out of the way and challenge old ways of doing things that have become entrenched. This has really become clear, I think, particularly in the adoption of virtual and contactless delivery systems in healthcare. We see that providing universal public access to diagnostics and care is not just the right thing to do, it's an economically smart thing to do during a pandemic. We expect that the pandemic will create market growth in a number of areas, presenting opportunities, and the most obvious one in the Western world is infectious diseases research, which has not received the degree of attention that perhaps it has deserved. We'd also note that in terms of market development, the long-term impacts of coronavirus are yet to be seen. It's a pretty weird disease, and there's a huge amount not yet known about the long-term health implications of it. So when we take these 33 or so lessons learned that we've gone through and sort of try to draw conclusions from them, we've really drawn in the study 5 main core conclusions and a series of recommended actions based upon those. The first of these is clearly that prior investments and advancements towards a robust life science ecosystem matters greatly. Fundamentally, I think what we've presented is a good news story. We found that life sciences ecosystems have proven to be rather resilient, and the biopharmaceutical industry has been a real star in responding fast and unselfishly to the challenge. The project also provides an opportunity to communicate that investment in life sciences is hugely important, societally and economically. It's also strategic. It's like defense in that regard. It has to be there when you need it. It has to pre-exist. It represents a long-term investment that pays off in terms of economic development and societal and economic resiliency. Another key conclusion is that the promotion of collaborations is a key to quickly mobilizing and pursuing new medical innovations. We think the role that collaborations have played in advancing solutions to the pandemic should not be overlooked. There may well be policy implications here, and largely those may revolve around antitrust and anti-competitive laws, but also perhaps the development of pre-authorized funding pools that could be used to rapidly advance promising technology areas through collaborations when critical events occur. Our third key takeaway is that the convergence of digital technology with life sciences technologies helps accelerate innovations and supports ecosystem resiliency. I expect that's a bit of an under-recognized issue, and that those life science ecosystems that recognize this and build a robust position will be best positioned for future advancement. This ties, of course, into a real need for advancement in STEM education and in paying attention to convergence between life sciences skills and analytics skills. There is going to be, indeed there already is, a huge competition for talent in that space, and that talent will be mobile, they'll be internationally in demand, and there's public policy implications in terms of assuring access to international talent, not just developing domestic talent pipelines. The fourth takeaway is clearly that flexibility in government regulatory approaches makes a difference. And perhaps there's a need to strike while the iron is hot here, to leverage the positive lessons learned that are highlighted in the study to encourage flexibility and responsiveness in the regulatory and oversight system. I'd recommend that to be encouraged as a new normal, especially since technology development is accelerating, and places that are too inflexible in adapting are likely to lose out on innovation opportunities. And finally, the existing business environment for innovation in life sciences ecosystems has proven to be very agile and able to be effectively leveraged through the COVID-19 pandemic. There are, of course, quite significant differences from one geography to another in how complete those ecosystems are. There's an opportunity, I think, to collectively express that there's a need to evaluate ecosystem completeness in each country, in each life science location, and then act and invest to assure life science ecosystem gaps that were observed during the pandemic are addressed, and that those ecosystems will be well equipped and resourced for the future. And in the report, we suggest multiple areas for consideration. So the full report is freely available on our website for download. That's at TEConomy or one word, .com. I'd certainly like to extend our thanks to Pfizer for financially supporting our research on this project. And again, thanks to ITIF for the opportunity to present to our work today. And I'll now turn back to Stephen.
Well, Simon, thank you very much for that fantastic presentation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Patrick Holmes from Pfizer. And Patrick, I want to say thanks to you and your team at Pfizer for your leadership in innovating and developing the mRNA-based vaccine in collaboration with your German partner BioNTech. And of course, that vaccine received FDA approval last week and is being rolled out across the United States now as we speak. Really a fantastic innovation. I'm excited to hear more about its developments and hear your perspectives. So Patrick, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks, Stephen, and thanks, Simon, for that terrific overview of the work. As Stephen mentioned up front, my name is Patrick Holmes, and I lead Pfizer's Science and Innovation Policy team. And we cover a variety of different global health policy initiatives and issues, including focusing on R&D driven ecosystems, value and innovation frameworks, the sustainability of health systems going forward, and also lead Pfizer's global policy initiatives on battling antimicrobial resistance, which could be part of the upcoming risks that we'll see going forward. Steve also mentioned that I'm a long-term Pfizer colleague, and that is true. I've worked throughout the company in a variety of different roles in both US and global marketing, new product planning. I spent some time in R&D, portfolio management, market intelligence, and joined global policy a few years ago. So I have a pretty broad perspective on the issues that we're discussing today, and the issues that Simon mentioned in the policy research that he just presented. And just wanted to also thank the Information Technology Innovation Foundation again for hosting this event. This is such an important topic, particularly given what we're all facing in terms of the pandemic, and it's really exciting to be part of this discussion alongside my fellow panelists. And thanks to the attendees for participating as well. I just wanted to give a little bit of history of the work with TEConomy. So one of the roles that we have within the policy organization at Pfizer is interacting with stakeholders on a variety of different topics. And frequently those interactions have focused on questions about how can different countries drive a more vital life science economy and drive investment from companies, particularly in R&D and manufacturing. And based upon the questions that we received, and we did some research on this, we found that there was actually a pretty significant gap in terms of what was really needed to answer those questions that we were receiving. And we actually reached out to TEConomy because they had done so much work on this, particularly in the U.S. market, and looked to them to answer some of these questions. So today's discussion is a further adaptation of some of those earlier pieces of work that we did with TEConomy, because I think we've all realized that the COVID-19 pandemic offers really a perfect proving ground for some of the hypotheses and some of the frameworks that Simon discussed. And so I wanted to build further from a Pfizer-specific standpoint on Simon's first two recommendations, and those were the importance of prior investments and then the importance of collaborations. And so I'm sure everyone has seen the progress that we and others have made with mRNA vaccines this year, and it's really been nothing short of incredible. But there's a long history of investing in these types of vaccines and in this platform technology. And the research behind this idea has been going on for decades, both within government as well as within the private sector. So the progress that we've made this year relies on years and years of experimentation, failures, and refinements. And some of you might know that actually our relationship with our German partner BioNTech started with a deal signed with them in late 2018, actually focused on advancing mRNA-based vaccines, but for flu. And that deal included $120 million in upfront equity and near-term research payments. Our ability to make that type of early phase investment is really strongly linked to the overall strength of the research ecosystem, both right now and also our confidence in how strong that system will be in the future, and is a really important part of the ongoing pandemic response. So as I mentioned, one of my roles at Pfizer was in R&D portfolio management, and I was involved in scores of analyses around these types of investments, like the first collaboration that we built with BioNTech, where there's significant risks of failure and any potential revenues are years away. And some of those discussions, I can tell you, were some of the most challenging ones that I've witnessed in my career at Pfizer. And the perspective of what you need to believe and the strength of, frankly, the R&D ecosystem when you make those types of long-term risky R&D investments is, in my view, too often missing from discussions that are focused on what you need to drive innovation and investment more broadly. So in addition to the importance of long-term investments, having a prior relationship with BioNTech also greatly facilitated the early discussions around COVID-19. And this is a real paramount example of the types of collaboration that Simon described. And I agree is a critical component of strong R&D ecosystems. And that's been obviously an important part of our response, and the ability to work so closely with BioNTech and take advantage of their skills and expertise, as well as a company like Pfizer's. The other collaboration that is playing out as we speak this week, and I'm sure you've seen it, is our partnership with the U.S. government and Operation Warp Speed around the distribution of the vaccine. And our ability to plan for and execute this complex distribution strategy is really due to the strong collaboration that we've built at multiple levels and with multiple parts of the U.S. government, and the extensive planning that has been put in place. This is a massive operation, and we still have a ways to go. But so far, the early efforts are quite promising. So finally, I did want to add some broader perspective on the pandemic, and there have been many lessons, and we're talking about obviously the R&D piece of the lessons today. But another crucial one is that spending on healthcare is critical, and it really should be thought of as an investment that is tightly linked to the economic well-being of societies, and we're absolutely seeing that play out right now. And unfortunately, this type of longer-term perspective is often lacking in discussions on healthcare budgets. And we understand that there are significant economic pressures facing healthcare systems due to the pandemic and other demographic issues that they're facing. And we realize the tough situation that countries face. But ultimately, what we believe is that spending smartly and efficiently while building more resilient and equitable health systems will require that we prioritize investment in areas of health that produce substantial value and produce positive patient outcomes. And we're happy to be and looking forward to be part of those discussions going forward. At Pfizer, we're particularly focused on the benefits of prevention, vaccination, and the value of innovative medicines. And as per this roundtable today, we also need to invest in areas that will help systems prepare for the next pandemic, including policies that support a strengthening of the R&D ecosystem, again, as per today's discussion. And Pfizer looks forward to continuing to play a leading role in building these ecosystems and continue to play a leading role in bringing innovation to patients and society. So thanks very much. And I think I'm going back to, to Stephen here. Stephen, you're on mute, I think.
Thank you, Patrick, for those excellent remarks and reminding me that I was on mute. Appreciate that excellent presentation. With that, let me now turn the floor over to our colleague, David Beyer from Bay Area Capital. David, thank you for joining ITIF again. We did a great event over the summer examining the impact of startups in America's biopharmaceutical innovation system. So it's great to have you with us today and to hear your responses to Simon's report. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to Pfizer for sponsoring this stunning, frankly, amazing report. I've been in and around the life science industry for decades, and this is one of the best reports I've ever seen. And I would urge people in the audience to read it and then put it down and read it again, because it's very deep and very content rich. I would like to take off from what Patrick ended with, which is a realization that the life science infrastructure is part of our national security and economic security. and that we need to view it as somewhere between a combination of the Defense Department and the Federal Reserve. If you look at the human toll from the pandemic, number of lives lost, number of people infected, long-term disabilities, and the magnitude of the economic consequences in unemployment, business closures across the world, it's trillions and trillions of dollars. And the only way to get out of a pandemic like this one is the intervention of pharmaceutical products like vaccines, monoclonal antibodies, and the like. As supportive as I and I think other public health thought leaders are about social distancing and testing and masks, and those things are not going to arrest or prevent the disease from spreading in a sufficient way to get us back to something approaching health and economic normalcy. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about how to use this report to get to a scale where countries can do better in preparing for the next pandemic. I've been writing on this topic for more than 4 years, that is pandemic preparedness. And I have to say, the United States did a terrible job of preparing. And that has left us in a bad place. But there are some bright spots, and I think this report points to them. Investment in biomedical research has been really good, both by government and especially by the industry. Key component of that, and something that's worth emphasizing, it's in the report, but I just want to underline it, is the need for transparency and sharing information broadly. To the extent that things are kept in walled gardens, it's a problem in the research world. The evolution from sequence in January of 2020 to a vaccine this week being delivered to people is a 100-year level scientific accomplishment. And it could not have happened without transparency and sharing information. To the extent that nationalism interferes with that or suggests that scientists should keep information to protect some kind of national goal, that's an important issue to address. Second, I think the quality and diversity of the workforce is something worth emphasizing. That has implications for immigration policy. I think the United States has gone down the wrong road on immigration in the last 4 years. And in the long run, that will be harmful to our national security. Similarly, I think this year on racial inequity has shown that the industry and government needs to do a better job of being inclusive of disadvantaged communities, communities of color. And the recent effort led by Merck and others called 110 to increase the number of people of color in the industry is an important initiative, and I think will add to the degree of equity offered by the products of the life science industry. So I think those are worth noting. There are a couple things that I think in the report could merit additional emphasis. One is the central role of intellectual property. If you do not have a strong patent or market exclusivity system, it's very difficult to create incentives for investors to invest. The United States and Europe have very strong IT systems, and China in recent years has taken pretty dramatic steps to improve their intellectual property structure. They're not there yet, for sure, but I think that's something that undergirds a lot of the development. Next point of further emphasis, innovation is great, new products are great, but somebody's got to pay for them. And as Patrick said, I think we've been underinvesting in a number of things. Rare and tropical diseases need some kind of market signal, advanced market commitments, assured reimbursement, coverage and reimbursement. Those kinds of things can send the signal to private sector investors, venture capital, private equity, to encourage people to get into areas like vaccine development, which there was a long fallow period where that wasn't happening. So I think those components are worth focusing on. I think I'll close with one last observation. Both the industry, government, and society in general need to stand up for truth and the scientific method. Unfortunately, in the last number of years, that kind of misinformation or malinformation has pervaded society in a number of different countries. And whether it's climate change or life science, there is a difference between fact and fiction, and fact and hoax. And unfortunately, some national leaders have chosen to dispute science. And I think we need to return to an era where we can make the distinction, because if we can't, people won't have confidence in vaccines and won't take them, and we will never get to a community level of immunity. So the wonder of the Pfizer effort with BioNTech and Moderna and others is not going to mean much if not enough people take the vaccine. And the root cause of that is people not understanding science or not trusting science. And we all have a responsibility to do something about that. Look forward to the questions.
Stephen, you're muted.
Thank you, David, for those excellent remarks. Really appreciate them. I want to remind our audience that you can submit questions via the Slido application. We already have several. Before I open it up to the floor, though, for questions, I wanted to pick up on a couple of comments from some of the presenters. The first, from Simon and David, really is this importance of intellectual property. It's very difficult to achieve innovation without the protection of ideas. And in the life sciences industry, we have truly the world's most R&D intensive industry. It's an industry that engages in the lengthy, risky, complex, expensive process of innovating new drugs. It can take 12 to 14 new years to bring a new biologic drug through pipelines at a cost approaching $3 billion. These companies depend upon the ability to protect their intellectual property, both from being pilfered, but also so that they can have a period of time where they can enjoy reasonable profits to recoup the investments, and then to have money to reinvest in future generations of biomedical innovation. So what's the cure for cholesterol or diabetes that leads to the future potential to invest in treatments for new forms of cancer, for COVID-19 therapeutics and diagnostics. And so I think what the COVID-19 crisis really has shown is that intellectual property rights are not the problem. In fact, the problem was that we did not have the intellectual property we needed. And that's why we had to invest to develop mRNA vaccines like Pfizer's, BioNTech's, and Moderna's. Why we needed to bring forward new therapeutics like Gilead's remdesivir. And so when we look at what's happening in the international community today, you see calls, World Trade Organization, Trips from countries like South Africa or India to suspend IP rights, to perhaps issue compulsory licenses for intellectual property developed in response to the COVID-19 crisis. That's not the way to go. We had to have intellectual property to respond to this crisis. Certainly we need to address questions of access in an equitable way across the global community to ensure that global society has access to these vaccines. But that's a far different question from suspending intellectual property rights in the effort to get there. One other point on IP to pick up on, I think, has actually been the importance of one provision of intellectual property that the U.S. pioneered called the Bayh-Dole Act. This is legislation initially introduced in 1980 that gives universities and nonprofit research institutions like Sloan Kettering Cancer Center rights to the intellectual property they generate from federally funded research. The Economist called the Bayh-Dole Act, quote, possibly the most inspired piece of legislation to be enacted in America over the past half century. It's been emulated by 24 countries around the world at least, and has led directly to over 300 new drugs and vaccines that have been developed through public-private partnerships facilitated through the Bayh-Dole Act since its enactment in 1980. The Bayh-Dole Act has been a critical part of America's life sciences innovation system, and it's been important in COVID as well. In fact, Moderna credits the pivotal role of patents in the field of messenger RNA and associated mRNA delivery technologies, which it licensed from Harvard and the University of Pennsylvania in its development of its vaccine. So I would call upon policymakers to recognize the important role of Bayh-Dole in America's life sciences innovation system, and to resist what's been called March rights, where governments have, in theory, the ability to go in afterwards and control prices of products derived in part from technologies intellectual property licensed through Liability. One other point to mention, as my colleagues Nigel Corey and Phil Stevens of the Geneva Network wrote this summer in a report titled Building a Global Health Framework for Digital Health Services in the Era of COVID-19, it's important that we maintain open global health data flows. Viruses cross borders seamlessly, and so too then does data, health data, needed to combat that virus. Now, of course, with appropriate privacy protections for patients, but we need to push back on some countries' efforts to introduce data protection laws that would say that health data about their citizens can only be stored or only processed within their countries. We need a framework that supports global biomedical innovation through data while protecting privacy rights. And lastly, the importance of federal funding. In fact, while we have seen some increases in NIH funding last year as part of the coronavirus response, the reality is that America's national institutes of health funding as a share of GDP is still 12% below where it was in 2003 levels. The Biden administration, we would call to work with Congress going forward to restore NIH funding levels to at least 2003 as a share of GDP. That would mean at least $12 billion more annually for NIH, and to maintain steady increases, perhaps ideally 2 to 3 percentage points increases in years going forward to ensure that we are, as a society, investing in this basic biomedical life sciences research that is the platform for future innovations. With that, let me pick up on a couple of questions we have received from the audience. I'll just call out a couple and invite responses. The first one we received was, what are the 3 best practices learned about response and resiliency during this pandemic that can help us better prepare for and possibly eliminate future pandemics? And maybe I'd also ask, David, is there a country or a region you've seen, perhaps in the response to the COVID-19 crisis, or more generally, that has taken really concrete steps to enhance the capacity and competitiveness of its life sciences innovation system in the future?
Well, I'll take a stab at that first one about.
Simon, why don't you go first? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at those 3 key takeaways. I mean, clearly investing in fundamental research is crucial. It underpins all that comes behind it in terms of innovation and solving the pandemic. And I think if you look at the Pfizer vaccine or many of the other products coming through that are a result of mRNA technologies, there's a direct line of sight back there to the original investment in the Human Genome Project. That was fundamental research. It accelerated the development of technologies, sequencing equipment, and as a result, science has advanced to the point where scientists could it seemed almost overnight, sequence the genome of the virus and then advance into producing vaccine approaches very quickly. Secondly, I think the structuring of policies and regulations to facilitate collaborations. And there, as I agree with you, IP plays a very important role in that too. The reason companies have been able to collaborate is because their IP that they respectively contributed to the collaboration is protected and their trade secrets are protected. And I think thirdly, the facilitation of digitalization. I think the advancements of AI, of robotics and automation into the future will play a critical role. But the ability to do what we're doing here, talking online, I mean, the ability to virtualize so much of our economy was a real star in pandemic response.
Great.
So let me try and answer your second question, Stephen. I would call 2 countries as exemplars of progress in life science. One is China and the second is the United Kingdom. I'll be brief on each. In the China case, as Simon indicated, the Human Genome Project, which was at least the first road markers were announced when I worked in the White House in 1999. And China was responsible for sequencing 3% of the human genome using borrowed equipment from NIH. And their scientists worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And China was not thought to be a major player in life sciences. In the last 20 years, the government has invested massive amounts of money in basic R&D spending, and they've created an infrastructure, lab space in Pudong outside Shanghai, but also private Chinese investors have created world-class companies producing first-in-class molecules and vaccines. To think that in 20 years you can go from where China was to where they are today is absolutely stunning. And it is a top-down government, and there's some deep flaws, no doubt, but they had a plan and they've implemented it. And one of the key components that's featured in the report is they adopted Western, US, Japanese, Australian, European regulatory regimes. And they've been very adaptive in how they use government policy to advance their industry. In the United Kingdom, I think the collaboration between Oxford, the university, and the private sector is remarkable. And it's produced, I think, a very promising new vaccine. And if you'd asked me 10 years ago whether that was possible, I would have said no. So I think we all should take a step back and realize we cannot predict the future because we don't fully understand a key component of what's in the report. Countries have it in their power to change the direction of their own life science industry if they follow the best practices from other countries, which is one of the reasons why this report is so important.
Great, thanks, David. Let me combine two questions received from the audience. Is there a key tax incentive that Congress can either make or strengthen that can encourage continued life science investment and research in the United States? And how can we incentivize domestic production and manufacturing to accelerate advanced production methods, as Simon discussed? Welcome anyone's reactions to those questions.
Well, I think
Patrick, you want
fundamentally,
to go first?
Yeah, maybe I can make a comment here. I mean, certainly there's a lot of discussion in markets around the need to have resilient manufacturing and resilient supply systems, and the need for potentially localizing those systems. So we're a little cautious about some of those discussions, to be honest. As we talked about a little bit earlier, we think that largely the biopharma supply chain has proven to be quite resilient during the pandemic, and certainly there have been issues, but largely those have been managed. And where we've seen more harm has been when governments have put in controls that have made it very difficult for us, for example, to export out of certain countries. So we understand that this needs to happen at some level, and building a more resilient system makes some sense. But I have to say, we prefer to see it from an incentive perspective rather than being forced upon us.
Yeah, I may agree in part with Patrick's observation and disagree in part. First, to answer the question about tax incentives, I frankly would focus on tax incentives. I would focus on supply chain. Right now, 80 to 90% of API, active pharmaceutical ingredients, comes from outside the United States, predominantly China and India. I was part of a National Academy of Medicine study on harmonization, and we dealt with that question. I think that has serious national security implications, and redundancy in supply chain, even for something like a commodity, is something worth paying attention to over a long period of time. It's not something that can happen precipitously. On the flip side, this is where I agree with Patrick, it makes no sense to have a America-only manufacturing policy when there are allies of the United States in military terms, South Korea, Japan, Canada, Australia, Europe, where supply chain should be strengthened and made more resilient as opposed to just relying on the United States. And I'm less concerned about commodity level products, including some monoclonal antibodies that are made in China, as provided there is a plan for improving and increasing manufacturing in the United States in the medium term, so that we have backup facilities in case of supply disruption as opposed to geopolitical conflict.
I'd add that R&D tax credits, are beneficial, particularly for early stage companies, and that credits for early stage investors in life science companies, given the very high level of risk in early stage biosciences companies and the degree of capital burn that's involved with early stage life sciences companies as they take their products through trials and regulatory approvals. It's very expensive. And really any incentives that encourage the flow of capital into the industry is very beneficial.
I would just add to that question that over the summer, ITIF released a report called Ensuring U.S. Biopharmaceutical Competitiveness, which contained well over 50 recommendations about how we can strengthen America's life sciences innovation system, including a number of R&D tax credit policies we can introduce. In particular, we have called for Congress to actually expand the rate of the alternative simplified credit R&D tax credit from 14 to 28%. For years, America had the world's most generous R&D tax credit. But a recent ITIF study found that we're now lower than 35th in the OECD, and countries like Brazil, India, and China actually have R&D tax credits 3 times more generous than ours. We could bring back and incentivize further investment in rare disease R&D innovation by restoring the orphan drug tax credit to a level of 50%. And we think it would be worth restoring Section 936 of the tax code to ensure greater production in territories such as Puerto Rico.
I'd also emphasize, Stephen, that for policymakers, particularly here in the United States, but internationally as well, I mean, there's 2 associations that I think are particularly good to engage with in terms of understanding the issues of the industry and what's needed in those ecosystems. And those are PhRMA, Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, and Biotechnology Innovation Organization. They do a lot of work to be a voice of the industry and understand the needs of these ecosystems and their development. So they're very good organizations to engage with.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think another point is the importance of public-private partnerships. If we think about NIMBLE, the National Institute for Innovation in Biopharmaceutical Manufacturing, one of America's 16 now institutes of innovations for manufacturing USA, making important contributions in new ways to do a continuous flow of manufacturing of biopharmaceuticals. I think that the point for policymakers should be to try and resist Made in America or Buy America policies that force or compel local procurement, but to introduce policies based on innovation that can try and bring back some of this PPE or biopharmaceutical manufacturing where it can be competitive on our shores. We have several more questions. We can go probably 5 more minutes, I think, and receive and get through these questions, if that's okay with our panelists. I think a couple of these questions are important. How should we consider the big race of vaccines between big powers? How should we balance the vaccine needs between developed countries and developing countries? Simon, I know your report talked about the WHO Solidarity Initiative. It talked about COVAX effort. Maybe COVAX would be something to address, because that is an effort by the international community to expand vaccine manufacturing, development, and distribution to those throughout the world who are going to need it.
Yeah, that's the COVAX facility, as it's called, and is indeed a multinational collaboration to advance vaccine availability for the developing world. And of course, when you're in a global pandemic, it's in nobody's interest to pay attention to just one part of the world in terms of its health. You can't reopen the world's economy unless we get vaccines throughout the whole world, developed and developing. It's critically important.
Yeah, maybe I can just add to that. I mean, obviously, this is a monumental task, and we've committed, along with the rest of the industry, to ensuring that our vaccines and medicines during the pandemic that are targeted at the pandemic in particular are widely accessible and affordable. And again, I think we're making great strides there. If you've heard some of the comments that we've made, we're doing pricing pretty in a pretty in a very responsible manner with different tiers according to the developing nature of the economies that we're facing. We have deals now signed with over 30 countries, but there's still a long way to go, and we're committed to working tirelessly to do it, and looking forward to our progress. But we do have some additional ground to make up here.
Just one addendum to those comments, which I agree with. As we look at the investment, particularly in the United States in vaccines, which is at this point about $20 billion, we've only invested about $1 billion in monoclonal antibodies, which could be both therapeutic and prophylactic. And there's a serious shortfall in monoclonal antibody production capability. And so I think one of the challenges for the incoming Biden administration is going to be how to create incentives, not just to produce enough of those antibodies for this pandemic, the next pandemic, and for endemic diseases, but how to do that on a global scale. And it's a complicated product. It's not half as complicated as the Pfizer vaccine in terms of complexity of distribution. It's going to be essential for making sure that we don't end up with dramatic inequities between economically advanced countries and those who are not. Those kinds of monoclonal antibodies can arrest and prevent disease, and we need to plan against that scientific advance, which is an important one in addition to vaccines.
Okay. A question perhaps for Simon or Patrick. How do you reconcile the need for information sharing and transparency with the importance of maintaining strong IP? Has this pandemic showed us better ways to approach that trade-off?
Patrick, you want to take that one to begin with?
Yeah, sure. I mean, they shouldn't be in opposition. The IP system is built upon sharing of scientific information. So I don't think that those two are in conflict. And I will say that the hunger for information and for being more transparent in a variety of different issues that we're facing in the pandemic is obvious, and it'll be interesting to see how those discussions kind of continue post pandemic, because I mean, we're obviously being asked to do things like, so for example, we published our the COVID-19 vaccine protocol online, and I haven't seen that before. I think it was the right thing to do, but that was and we were, we did it in a way that we were comfortable with, but in the end that was a step that I hadn't really necessarily seen before, and it'll be interesting to see how we and other companies manage the quest and the thirst for information and the need for information going forward.
Fantastic. Well, with that, I think we better draw this discussion to a close. Let me ask if our panelists have any closing or final concluding remarks that they'd like to make.
Nothing from my end. Just thank you very much.
Yeah, I thank you for the opportunity to present today, and for folks online for listening. And also, of course, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Mitch Horowitz and David Hockman, who worked with me on the report from TEConomy.
Well, wonderful.
Thank you to Pfizer for sponsoring the work, and great job by TEConomy.
Thank you, David.
Indeed. Well, with that, let me say thank you to Simon, Patrick, and David. I think it's been a great discussion. It's a fantastic report. Video of this event will be posted on the ITIF website and our YouTube page by this afternoon for sharing with others to watch. With that, let me say thank you, and we look forward to continue to collaborate with you on tackling these important life sciences innovation issues. Thank you all for joining.